Today I'd like to talk about the temples in the south of Egypt. This is a very important talk, I believe, and if you've already seen my videos on the pyramid plan, I've done a series with 6 videos which explain how the pyramids are positioned and how the meter length was used to position the different pyramids. That's interesting to watch. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about the temples in the south of Egypt and the incredible geometry that links them together over very long distances with precise measurements. It's important when we talk about Egypt to talk about the timeline. Egypt was a civilization which lasted for thousands of years, and there are very different things going on according to the time we're talking about. We're going to be centered today on the temple of Seti I in Abydos, and I'll be coming back to Seti in a minute. But Abydos is a very, very important place in Egyptian history because things have been found there which date back to pre-dynastic times and even before pre-dynastic times, if we can say that. Certain things have been found in the sand at Abydos that date back to 4,400 BC. Which is a very, very long time ago. It's the time the megaliths were being built in Karnak. And what we're going to talk about also is the period in the New Kingdom, Seti I and his son, Ramses II, and the temples that they were involved in. That's a lot later, around 1290 BC. Now, at Abydos was found this blade, a knife handle here, which you can see is called the Master of Animals. There is a bearded man standing and holding 2 lions. On the left in the corner, we have a statue of a Sumerian priest, which was found in Uruk, in the south of the Sumerian area, in 3300 BC. And it's an accepted fact that the person in the knife found in Abydos is a Sumerian priest. We see he's got the same headgear on and the same beard. Now, that's an incredible fact that everybody should know about because it should clearly show that there were relationships and commerce of some kind between south of Egypt and Sumeria. This link is kind of suggested, but it's never really put forward. It's very important, as we'll see in the next slide, because I think last year was discovered in the town of Sayburç in Turkey. This engraving, this is in a cellar. It's in what's called the Tastepla sites, which have now been discovered around Göbekli Tepe. Here we have another master of animals, so a man again standing between 2 lions. So this area here is now in southeast Turkey, so it's a long way north of Sumeria. And this is dated to 10,000 BC. So we're getting exactly the same representation, a man standing between 2 lions and seemingly getting on quite well with them. And this symbol seems to have continued over thousands of kilometers and over thousands and thousands of years. Now, if we look at this map of Egypt, we see the temple of Seti at Abydos, which is here, It's just near the Nile here, and it's just before the bend in the River Nile, which is very important and is where Karnak, Thebes, the ancient capital of Egypt, was situated. It's an area where suddenly the Nile is no longer flowing from south to north. Well, we get a change in direction, a radical change in direction here. I've also put on this map Abu Simbel, right in the south of Egypt, the temple right in the south, which was built by Ramses II, and Pi Ramses, right in the north in the delta, which was a new town, built also by Ramses II. These two towns are north, these two places, Abu Simbel and Pi Ramses, are north-south of each other, and the temple of Seti in Abydos is not far from that north-south line. So there's an organization here going on at the time of Ramses II. So here are the different temples in the south of Egypt that we're going to be looking at. But in the first part of this talk, I'm going to be looking at the temples more in the north. Well, this is Edfu, which is a southern temple, a very important temple. I've talked about this in another talk I did about the use of the golden ratio in the calendar. I mentioned the work of Gyula Priskin, who has shown perfectly clearly that the dates engraved in these temples show exact relationships in number of days according to the golden ratio. It's quite astounding fact, and it's engraved in the stone of the temples. So we can calculate the exact number of days before the different events and see that the relationship of these numbers of days gives the golden ratio, which is clear proof that the golden ratio was used and known in ancient Egypt. So this is Edfu, it's its forecourt. This is the forecourt. The pronaos is the forecourt. And then behind that we have the naos, which is the beginning of the temple, the inner temple. Here's a representation of what this whole thing must have looked like when it was in full swing. And now Dendera. Dendera is another temple on the Nile. The site of Dendera has been dated back to about 3000 BC, so it's a very old site. But the present-day temple was built between 305 and 30 BC. It's the Temple of Hathor, and we can see her head here on the different pillars. This is the inside of the temple. It's incredibly engraved. All the walls are covered with inscriptions. On the right here, we see this very, very long, thin staircase which leads up to the roof and has these kind of stairs which seem either very worn. In some places, they look like they've melted, which has given rise to a lot of supposition. But as you can see, every square inch of the walls is covered with hieroglyphs and messages. This is from the roof of Dendera. These photos were taken by my friend Robert Temple. And you can see here the roof and the desert. And on the right here is the sunken sacred lake where it was possible to go down into the water here. On the roof is the temple of the zodiac, so the famous circular zodiac of Dendera, which is dated to about 50 BC. And it was on the roof here. It's now in the Louvre Museum, and at Dendera there's a copy of it. Okay, and here again you see the head of Hathor everywhere. Again, inside the temple, amazing engravings on the roof, under the arches. An incredible amount of work. Here's the ground plan. And this is the pronaos, is this side, and then you go further and further into the depths of the temple. This is the temple of Luxor, very well known and much visited, has an international airport in Luxor. This dates from 1392 BC to 1213 BC, so Seti I and Ramses made additions to this temple. An important fact to point out, it has one obelisk. The other obelisk is at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Okay, so it's kind of lopsided now. It's got one side missing. There are massive statues to the entrance of the temple, and you can see they the skin seems to be coming off here. The way these statues were made is quite particular. What has caused this desquamation here on these statues? Very interesting thing. Here I have a little video that a friend of mine took. These are incredible statues that are here at the entrance to this temple. And here we can see an axis of the temple with the different engravings. Now there are different axes of it. This temple changes direction. So we have the first axis, which goes from right at the beginning of the temple through here, across this central courtyard and up this central corridor till we come to this part. And here the axis changes direction and goes off in this direction. This is the direction then of the alley of the Sphinxes. There are hundreds or thousands maybe of sphinxes with ram's heads. And here you can see how this axis goes right up that central alley of Sphinx and continues all the way up to the entrance gate here to the Karnak temple towards the north here. Okay, which will be the subject of a different talk. So it's just to explain how there's a change in axes and how these axes go on for very long distances. Now, here on Google Earth, from the south point, if I come back to the previous slide, this slide, I've put a point here where it says Luxor Temple, which is the most southerly point of the central axis here. And if from that point I draw a perfect east-west line, so a line perfectly towards the east, I come to a point here in the desert. And this point is very important because it's a link between the temple of Edfu to the south here and the temple of Dendera to the north. So the distance between Dendera and Edfu, you can see here, is 130.617 meters, so 130 kilometers. So it's a very long distance. There was interaction between those two temples because Hathor will be taken out of the temple and put on a bark, which would come down the Nile all the way down to Edfu, and then she'd spend some time with Horus in the temple of Edfu, and then go all the way back up to the temple. So there was interaction clearly between these two temples. And if we draw this line that links them, so the Nile is a kind of snake that goes round the line here, then the exact southern point of Luxor Temple, I've done a thick line here so we can see it, but it's perfectly precise. This will cut this distance of 130.617 meters in the following way. Between this line and the Temple of Dendera are 49,890 meters, and to the south, 80,727 meters. You can check up on this on Google Earth. It's perfectly precise. But what we discover is that if we take the overall distance, if we take the relationship first between these two measurements, we get the golden ratio, 1.618098. This is 80,727 divided by 49,890. If we take the overall distance and we divide it by the longer distance of the two, 80,727, we get this number, again, 1.6180. Again, the golden ratio, of course, because the golden ratio, by definition, gives a ratio between the shorter part and the longer part of a straight line is the same as the ratio between the longer part and the whole. So we can see it here, but what's quite incredible is that this is precisely positioned by the southern point of Luxor Temple. Okay, so a 1 to phi relationship in the positioning of these two temples with respect to the Luxor parallel. Now I'd like to go more into the temple of Seti in Abydos and its relationship with the temple of Ammon in Luxor. So this is Seti's temple in Abydos. It was started around, well, it's said 1300 BC. Abydos, Seti started his reign in 1295, so right from the beginning of his reign, he started this temple. Here's the mummy of Seti I. It's the most incredibly preserved and finely created mummy in Egypt. It's maintained incredible detail of his facial characteristics. And this has enabled people, here it's Curtis Ryan Woodside, who's reconstructed the face of Seti I from the mummy. Seti I died quite young. I think he wasn't even 40. Here we can see his temple from a distance with the cliff face in the background. Here are representations of Seti I in his temple. The engravings in Seti's temple are of extreme quality, recognized as some of the finest engravings in the whole of Egypt. And here's his sculpture, a statue of him. In the temple of Seti I is the king list of Abydos. This is, you can see all these different cartridges. All these are the cartridges of each pharaoh. This goes right back to pre-dynastic times. And this list is the most complete list and important list of the history of the pharaohs of Egypt. So you can see there are quite some number of them. Seti I's tomb as well is an incredible tomb. It's the finest and largest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And with, I think, one corridor is 134 meters long. It's dug into the heart of the mountain with steps going down and with different layers, and it's totally engraved. It was perfectly, first of all, sculpted and then painted. Unfortunately, it was destroyed once it had been discovered. A lot of it was destroyed or deteriorated by the people who were taking rubbings of it and all that kind of thing. But it still shows how important Seti I must have been. Behind the temple of Seti in Abydos is this sunken temple called the Assyrian, which is in the axis. It fills with water. Here it is at the back of the temple. So you have the major axis, the entrance here, and the pronaos and the temple. And then the Assyrian, the sunken temple behind it. Okay, here. And the temple of Seti I has this strange L shape to it, which is very, very unusual. I think it's unique in Egyptian temples. So now we're going to start looking at the relationship between the temple of Luxor and the temple of Seti in Abydos. And we're going to go down to a point that I've chosen here. which is in the axis of the Sphinx, the line of sphinxes, and we're right in front of the major temple here at this point, down the major axis. This is where the camera was put. My point isn't exactly here, but it's the nearest point. Okay, so we're just north of the temple. And from that particular point, bear with me, because you might say I'm putting a point anywhere, but you'll realize there's a reason for this if you stay with me on this. So from this point, we're going to draw a line here. This is using Google Earth, right up to the temple of Seti in Abydos, right across the Egyptian desert. Here we see the temple. This is orientated north-south. So the north is at the top of the page. And if we see the line, the yellow line, I'm putting over the red line, it goes right along the base of the temple. And if we look at the angle of that line, we see it's 306.87 degrees, which is 90 degrees plus 36.87. So if we take the tangent of that angle, we get, so here in the calculation, 306.87. If I take the tangent of that, I get the value minus 1.33333. See, minus because it's towards the west and we're going from north. So, and if I multiply that by 3, then I get 4. So we discover that this line coming from just north of the Luxor temple right to the base of the Abydos temple, at a distance of exactly 90,000 meters, so 90 kilometers, is on the perfect axis of a 3-4-5 triangle, and that the temple is exactly aligned on that. That's an incredible fact. It cannot be a coincidence that the temple is perfectly aligned towards Luxor. But we're going to see how far this science actually goes. So I'm going to take another point now, which is in the projection of the northwestern side of the temple here. That's where this red line starts. And it's just near the ramp that goes up into the temple. So I'm going to take a point here. And we're going to go back this time. We're going to go back to the temple of Luxor. This time we're going to go to the south side of the temple. So the first time we went from the north side of the temple up to the south side at Abydos. Now we're going from the north side of Abydos down to the southern point of the Luxor temple. And when I do this, when you can see I put the line right on the central point I'd positioned, we see that the angle we're getting here is 126.87 degrees. So this is 90 plus 36.87 degrees. That is again the exact angle to 100th of a degree of the 3-4-5 triangle. Okay, the distance here is almost 90,000 meters. If I pull the line a little further till I get to the wall, if I get to the most easterly wall of the temple, then we see we get exactly 90,000 meters on a perfect angle of a 3-4-5 triangle. Now, why are these two angles different? Why am I getting an angle? Why have I got two lines instead of one line? This is because the Earth is curved, okay? And so if I draw a line across a distance of 90 kilometers like that, then we're going to find that the line turns a slight amount. Okay, so if I draw the line in one direction and then I draw it back in the other direction, then the distance between the two, the median of those two lines, will give me the exact angle of a 3-4-5 triangle, as if I was on flat land. Okay? Now, let's take the line then, which goes between those two lines. It goes from the center of the temple of Seti in Abydos, and it goes down to the center of the temple of Luxor. Okay? So this line links the center of the two temples, and we can see how the size of these two temples, their relative size, eliminates the Earth's curvature, the deviation of the geometry or the deformation of the geometry linked to the Earth's curvature. Here you see the line coming down. Now the angle we get isn't 126.87. You see it's a smaller angle. And so this shows how the median line here has been calculated, and the size of the temples relative to each other has also been calculated to get this exact relationship over this massive distance. This is quite an incredible fact. This is the first time that anybody has talked about this, but it is pure fact. Anybody can go on Google Earth and check up with it. And so it shows quite clearly that the Egyptians who were building these temples had much higher knowledge than we imagine. How on earth did they get this to such incredible precision? This is something very important we should ask ourselves, because this isn't hypothesis, this is fact. And we see how the temple, especially how the back of the temple of Abydos, of Seti I, is exactly aligned on this angle of the 3-4-5 triangle, which goes to Luxor. So that's a very important fact. So let's look at the resume of that. Here we have the 3-4-5 triangle going right across here. It's interesting to point out that the temple of Luxor is bigger and longer than the temple of Seti, which means that the spot where the two lines cross isn't exactly in the middle of the line. It's slightly towards the temple of Seti. It's about here where I've got my arrow here. This is where the two lines cross over, around here, which is a very interesting fact. Okay, so we can see this triangle, 3 units of 18,000 meters, 4 units and 5 units, giving us the 3-4-5 triangle. This is the angle across the desert, okay, going from the temple of Seti down to Luxor. We can see the relief here, and coming down to the temple of Ammon in Luxor, the 3 lines. Now another fact is going to confirm the exactitude of these calculations, of this geometry. If now I take you back again, and we're going to look along this line that goes from the south of the temple of Seti in Abydos down to the north of the temple of Luxor, okay? So here we go down to it. And we're going to go down along the line, across the desert. But instead of going all the way to Luxor, we're going to stop on the way at the Colosseum of Memnon. And we see that as we pull down into the center of the image, the line goes exactly between those two massive statues, the Colosseum of Memnon, and then continues its path down to the Temple of Luxor. It's the same line we saw earlier. Here we see these colossi of Memnon here. They are massive blocks of quartzite stone, which has been brought maybe over 650 kilometers, I think, from the south of Egypt. They're monolithic, so they are sculpted. Quartzite is the hardest possible stone to sculpt. Okay, and they're monolithic, so they are single blocks of quartzite. So these massive blocks weighing over 1,000 tons of quartzite have been brought right to this spot and placed there like that as a kind of gateway marking something. They were put there around 1350 BC. And here you can see them in video. And yes, they're incredible and unexplained monuments, really. And their positioning here exactly on this line cannot be a coincidence. It must show that this axis had been planned before Seti I was born, because they date from 1350 BC. So this process, like the Temple of Luxor, so the Temple of Luxor was already built, these were built, and the whole thing was in process of being built from 1350 BC. So that's the end of the first part of my talk on these southern Egyptian temples. And I'm going to do a second part of this talk with some more incredible geometry of the same kind as what we've just seen in the second part. So join me for that, and thanks for watching.